You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 313 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, news about social media censorship. We're going to talk about the controversy surrounding Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, updates on Venezuela, and Turkey's decision to buy the S-400 air defense system from Russia. Share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute, where this show and my daily news roundup are featured on the homepage. So just search up libertarianinstitute.org. Of course, that site is run by the great Scott Horton, who was the guest on the last episode of the show. So go back and listen to that if you haven't already. One of my favorite episodes I've done in some time, just because I've had a bunch of questions building up on Venezuela, Iran, Afghanistan, nukes, and Scott took the time to answer all those for me. There's a ton of great information in there. I learned a lot, so I'm sure everybody else will too if you go back and listen to that. Make sure that you're subscribing to the show somewhere, if it's not iTunes or Stitcher or whatever podcatcher that you prefer, and then give it a rating and review there. I've noticed there's some new ones on the iTunes page, and I really appreciate it when you guys could take the time to do that. Last thing is, if you want to donate to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. First thing I want to talk about on today's show is yesterday we had the 77th anniversary of, I believe, the signing of the executive order that placed Japanese Americans in internment camps. You know, the government decided that the Japanese Americans were too dangerous to be out among the rest of us, and so we had to throw them in camps until this crisis is over. And, you know, they largely got away with it. And, you know, even when I was learning about it in school, it was always set in comparison to what Hitler did to the Jews. So it didn't seem like all that big of a deal because at least, you know, we weren't cooking the people in the ovens. But this is a very dark chapter in American history. And what I want to take from it and just say in today's show is that there's this real occurrence that when your country, culture, society, race decides to go to war with another, it's going to increase the hatred among your whole society, right? And so when you look at the treatment of Germans during World War II, the treatment of Russians and people from Eastern Europe during the Cold War, the current profiling and treatment of Muslims, you know, specifically what we did, you know, right in the wake of 9/11 with some of the torture stuff and sending people to Guantanamo Bay. All of this is a product of the wars. And so when you're looking at something like we have right now in Venezuela and deciding that the U.S. should take some kind of action against that country, understand that if U.S. troops go down to Venezuela and Venezuelans start killing U.S. troops, how do you think Americans and those, you know, people, families are going to start to feel about Venezuelans? Especially if, you know, the deaths start to mount, you know, or severe injuries start to mount into the hundreds and the thousands. Then you start to get larger groups and swaths of people who say, look at all of these, you know, young American boys and girls going to Venezuela, not Vietnam, and trying to help those people. And in return, they send them back in body bags. So I just wanted to take a minute on the, you know, anniversary of that bad event to point out that, you know, this is one of those costs of war that's rarely talked about. All right, on to news for today. Social media censorship stories here. Facebook has suspended 3 pages run by a journalist named Rania Khalek. I believe she's Lebanese, but all of her, you know, journalism is English first. I believe generally she runs this like in the now pages, which are, you know, left wing. I'm sure most of the time when libertarians share these that, you know, they're kind of in mockery or jest, but she does do a lot of good reporting on the wars as well. And so she's one of those kind of, you know, leftists that maybe her economics are laughable, but at least her war views and, you know, her journalism and take there is good stuff. Now, Facebook, there's 3 pages that were run by Rania, and one of them was called Soapbots. I forget the name of the other 2. Were suspended by Facebook. Facebook suspended these pages on the discovery and in coordination with CNN that the RT parent company, which I guess is essentially owned by the Russian government, was most of the funding source for these pages run by Rania Khalek. And so Facebook says that because it wasn't disclosed in the information for the pages, you have to do that before we are going to unsuspend your sites. Now, the problem here is that this isn't a consistent policy from Facebook. I think we had a situation kind of what's now on YouTube where everybody has to disclose public funding, BBC, RT, Sputnik, Al Jazeera. And I even, when I saw this on YouTube, I Googled around that even, some of the Western, sites all were forced to reveal their government funding. And so I don't have a problem with that policy. I actually, if it's done, fairly, I think it's probably a good thing for people to, read a news story and then to see, oh, so this is put out by the Saudi government, and so it has that spin on it. So it's an important thing to have on there, and, maybe Rania Khalek should have included that from the beginning, because I do know she takes strides to be an honest journalist. However, it's not a Facebook standard, and so this is a case where this one group of pages that happen to be affiliated with the Russian government were targeted. And I think it just generally points to the fact that CNN, looking rather to do reporting on the fact that Facebook doesn't have this standard, which I think could be an interesting kind of story, just decides to focus in and hone in on one site or group of pages that are Russian affiliated. Kind of shows where CNN's mind and bias is these days with the whole Russiagate hysteria. There's also an interesting move by Twitter to delete a tweet from Iran's supreme leader, that's the Ayatollah, reaffirming the, order or sentence from the previous Ayatollah Khalami against Salman Rushdie, who I honestly only know from Seinfeld, but apparently he wrote a book that was largely condemned by Islamic religious figures as being hateful towards their religion. Anyways, Khalami's order basically gave Rushdie a death sentence. So I guess Twitter's argument would be that, this tweet by the new Ayatollah is essentially kind of doubling down on a threat against, the author's life. However, Twitter has also in the past upheld that tweets from Donald Trump threatening Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, the old fire and fury tweets, would not be censored because they're kind of newsworthy announcements from world leaders. So I'm not sure, how Twitter decides to make these decisions. I think stories like this should provoke media attention and attention among Twitter users, and a discussion about, why the Twitter policy would delete this tweet and not others. Also, look who's on the Twitter board. I mean, at one point, Saudi Prince Al-Weed, I believe, was a 5% controlling interest in Twitter, and so that is now owned, I guess, by somebody in the Saudi state, and what impact it would have that, this particular tweet from the Ayatollah gets deleted. Not necessarily saying that there should be any congressional legislation on the issue, just that, if this is really going to be a platform that we're using to discuss politics and world events and everything, Twitter, I think, should be, transparent with their policies and also with who owns and is running the thing. All right, this stuff on Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has gotten a lot of media attention. She's gotten a lot of criticism, and I was honestly shocked by how little she said to get all this criticism and attention. Seems there were a couple events here. One was a House committee where she just took Elliott Abrams to task for about 3 minutes. Just saying that, hey, I don't know why any congressional committee would ever listen to you. Your past convictions for lying to the Congress show that you're willing to lie to them. So why the hell should anybody listen to you? And she also mentions his support for death squads and people's committing human rights abuses and atrocities in El Salvador, which he, at the end of it, kind of just doubles down on and says, yep, I did the right thing there, even though it led to the death of, children and innocent people and rapes and all kinds of terrible crimes. And then I think drawing even more criticism to herself was a reply, I believe, to maybe McCarthy, who is, close to the House leadership. And he had tweeted out something, I think, pro-Israel, and she responded, follow the Benjamins, and kind of then just pointed out that, AIPAC's lobbying effort and the money they donate to Congress has a large impact on U.S. policy. Now, I think it's clear, and I think most of my audience will agree, that she's right on both of these things. AIPAC has a lot of influence in the U.S. over politics, and Elliott Abrams has no business being anywhere near power, and he's a convicted liar to Congress, and he has no business testifying to Congress. He's lied us into enough wars already. Like, get him the hell away from TV cameras and of any importance whatsoever. Yet she's come under sharp attacks from this, even from her own party, which is a shame because in so many ways you have to think like, oh man, this is a young female Somali American congresswoman taking a old white man who has a history of government connections with the Bush administration, with the, entrenched neocons, has a history of committing war crimes, so much of the migrant crisis and everything going on in Latin America today that's chaotic has to do with the policies that were, advocated for by Elliott Abrams. And yet she gets criticism from her own party for this kind of stuff. So, that's ridiculous. But, most of it, I think the controversy has centered around her tweets about AIPAC saying follow the Benjamins and, that the congressmen are influenced by money. Now, I guess the congressman who she called, basically saying that you take bribes from AIPAC and vote for them isn't going to be happy with this, but this shouldn't even be a controversial statement. I mean, I think most Americans know that, and especially those who vote Democrat, that Congress is heavily influenced by big money interest, whether it be companies, individuals, AIPAC, NRA, pro-life, pro-choice, any of these, different committees, groups, labor unions, all have big money and they're able, to influence U.S. politics. And that's all she's saying. And this has resulted in calls for her to step down, claims that she's anti-Semitic and all this other terrible stuff. Now, I do want to make a few points here, mainly that the claims that, voicing that AIPAC has control over U.S. politics made you anti-Semitic is absolutely insane. Although that is something that's thrown out there every time anybody tries to stand up to AIPAC and say, you guys are corrupt and you're doing terrible things. And, the worldview that you're putting forward and the policies that you're advocating for will only lead to more suffering and do not paint a realistic situation of what's going on around the world. I do think it's worth mentioning that while, the AIPAC and associated groups are often called the Israel lobby, and I do it too, because, their essential policy that they, kind of hold as a cornerstone is that Israel is essentially important to U.S. Foreign policy, and they're kind of the democracy in the Middle East that we must support and all this other nonsense. However, interests for that are, heavily Sheldon Adelson. There's a lot of American evangelicals who support that policy for religious reasons. Weapons makers support these groups because that Israel-centric foreign policy leads to an awful lot of weapon sales and wars in the Middle East that benefit them. So there's all these other companies and weapons makers, industrial complex, religious affiliated kind of groups that support the Israel lobby. So I don't want to make it sound like there's, a group of Jewish people who get together and are the main influencers of U.S. policy overall. That's not correct. However, AIPAC does have a large interest in the United States. They spend a lot of money and they have, very successfully, because of, a confluence of, different other things going on, been able to craft an American foreign policy that is very beneficial to Israel and, their power projection in the Middle East, especially when you look at, what the Israeli interests are from the view of the Israel Likud party and the Netanyahu government. Not necessarily saying that every single individual Israeli citizen benefits from every U.S. policy that is, quote unquote pro-Israel. The last thing I want to mention here is an article, and I believe I read it in The Nation, but I'm definitely going to link to in the show notes page. It's by Ady, it's Andy without the N, so I think it's pronounced Ady Bankan, and this is apparently a former lobbyist and campaign advisor who tells a specific story of how they were running a campaign for a Democrat, I believe in Ohio, and were approached by AIPAC and basically given a quid pro quo. You change your positions on these issues and we will donate money to your campaign. Ady explains that, they took the money, that they thought it was a good deal, that they changed a couple little positions, and then that money they gave, to the campaign was almost enough to swing the election. They were way behind at the start of it, and this put them close. So, this was an example of AIPAC introducing money into a situation, changing the election results by several percentage points, even though it didn't actually swing it, and was able to change a candidate's stated policies on Israel. So, this is an obvious amount of influence right here. Here's an example of it happening. Now, one of the powerful things about this article is that, as the author explains right at the end of it, that they're dying from MS. This is, one of the last things they're going to be able to publish as, they kind of do the I-type thing. I think, we saw that with Stephen Hawkins, and it's really been expanded. It's great technology that allows people, even with a minimal amount of movement, to be able to communicate. And so this is, like a last confessional or something like that. Like, hey, I don't want to die with this on my conscience. So this is this bad thing that I was a part of in my lifetime. But it is really a great little story to explain how AIPAC does have, influence over U.S. politics, and how, Representative Omar is right about all that. I'll mention, going on in the House, Tulsi Gabbard has introduced a bill that would prevent the United States from spending any funds on weapons that would violate the INF treaty. The way I read this legislation is that even if the U.S. withdraws from the INF treaty, this, if it becomes law, would make it impossible for the U.S. to develop those land-based cruise missiles that are banned by the treaty. Venezuela, a lot of what I could say here today, it was, said by Scott Horton on the last episode of the show to check that out. But I do want to say that, there's more U.S. food aid. I think they say 250 million tons awaiting on the border with Colombia there. They really try to frame this, and, from all the imagery you get, this is some kind of great standoff between like the Venezuelan government trying to prevent aid from getting to the, people of the country, when in reality this is, part of the U.S. regime change effort, and it would undermine, Maduro if he allowed the aid into the country. So he's obviously going to resist that. And I think this is largely meant to be a publicity stunt, to, try to rally Americans to be like, hey, we really had to do something against Maduro. He's like Saddam. He's like Gaddafi. He's, hurting his own people, and we're going to come in and rescue him. I did read today that Brazil has been willing to join another neighbor of Venezuela with this wanting to bring aid into the country. And so if maybe they could do it at more different border crossings, it would make for great news coverage all day long. You have like this standoff where there's troops of either side, and, there's these aid convoys, and they really just want to bring them in and help the people. The U.S. sanctioned 5 members of Venezuela military and intelligence, very high-ranking officials. So again, so far, I'm not seeing any indication that, the military is going to break reins with Maduro. Although, as Scott Horton points out on the last episode of the show, when I had him on, that, my analysis here of the importance of that may not have been correct. That whether the military sits with the Maduro government may not be all that important. It's, all on the people and everything like that too. All right, so in Kashmir, this is India, Pakistan, and then the Kashmir region is in dispute. The Pakistani side is, kind of supports an independent Kashmir and Jammu, which is the neighboring region with Kashmir. And India wants, I believe, all of Kashmir and Jammu, even the part now administered by Pakistan, to be part of India. It's a heavily Muslim province, and so that creates some conflict with the Indian government, where there's a lot of long-standing conflict both with Pakistan, that the Muslim country next door, the Muslim minority in India, and then in the disputed Kashmir region between Muslim groups and even Muslim separatist groups and the Indian government. And Indian people in general, I guess, the large, like, Hindu majority population. One of the things that I recently read was that since Modi took power in his BJP party, there's been an increase of attacks on minority groups in India, and that many of them aren't even being investigated or reported. I think there's been 40 or so killings of, minority people in India. You have these groups of, I guess, kind of extremist Hindus who go around, and they're called cow patrols, and will kill or harass or assault people who are, eating cows or something, or, have beef, or are believed to have harmed a cow. I've read stories in the past couple of years where there's been gang rapes of young minority women. by, mass kind of mob type situations, and largely the people go unpunished for this. So those are kind of the tensions from the Indians' side, I guess. There's also the issue that separatist groups, kind of going back, I think, for Bangladesh, regions of India proper, and then, the Kashmir and Jammu region, separatist groups who have engaged in terrorist activities, suicide bombings, most recently one that targeted and killed over 40 Indian soldiers in Kashmir for a number of years. So you have the general hostilities between the governments of India and Pakistan, extremist acts being carried out by people of both groups, and then this, ongoing tension region of Kashmir and Jammu, which creates real problems. And, with India and Pakistan being two nuclear powers and having massive militaries, any kind of conflict here could kill a lot of people, even if it doesn't go nuclear. But it's hard to imagine a situation where it doesn't, when people point out the Indian military is just so large, it could probably run over the Pakistani military pretty quickly. And so they may have to use their nukes quick or not use them at all. And so it could, create a real situation where, very fast at the start of a conflict, Pakistan may make a decision to use nukes against invading Indian forces or something like this. So I hope that's a decent, quick breakdown of what's going on in Kashmir now for when you read the news stories. Reuters reported that, I guess, the kid who actually carried out this terrorist who carried out this suicide bombing in Kashmir, was previously beaten by Indian forces, and so that was kind of the grudge he was bearing against them. It's one of these things where there's just going to continue to be violence on each side until some kind of solution diplomatically is worked out here. And honestly, it seems like independence for people who don't want to be subject to government is the best solution. Other news on India, they signed a bunch of deals with Argentina for Argentina to, I believe, build some nuclear power plants in India, and for there to be a mutual defense pact between the two countries. Pakistan signed some deals with Saudi Arabia, $20 billion worth in total. And I didn't see a whole lot of disclosures on what all those agreements are, but it does show that, those two countries are, maintaining their strong relationship. I believe there's still Pakistani soldiers deployed to the southern border of Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure which area of that southern border, because if you look kind of towards the coastline area, a few hundred miles south of Mecca and Medina, there's been some Houthi crossing over the border into Saudi Arabia and carrying out attacks against, I guess, Saudi forces. I want to go over real quick this S-400 air defense system that Turkey is buying from Russia, just because it has some importance between the U.S. and Turkish relationship, of course, both NATO member countries. Turkey has been discussing buying this air defense system for years, but complications with the relationship in the United States, as far as the U.S. saying we're not going to sell you F-35s if you go ahead and buy this system. We're not going to sell you Patriot missiles if you buy the S-400. Really slowed it down. There were a lot of negotiations, but Turkey says they're now moving forward with it. There's a lot we could tie in here. Is Turkey buying it from Russia, trying to get safe zones put into Syria, or to have more influence on what goes on in the northern Aleppo and Idlib provinces of Syria? Are they doing it in hopes that they could get Russia to force Assad into a more restricted deal against the Syrian Kurds, as far as them having militias and armies and weapons and everything like this? Or do they just think it's a better system and they find it superior to either the American THAADs or Patriot missile systems, so they're going with the best product? Or if it's just a sign that Turkey generally wants to move closer with Russia in diplomatic issues. There's a lot of possibilities there, so I'm not sure how much we can read into that, but it does push Turkey, strategically out of NATO's air radar system, because, their radar system will now be with the Russian air defense and not with the rest of the Western-made air defense systems. With Syria, we have an important announcement from Donald Trump saying that European countries will be taking back 800 fighters that have that country's citizenship that are currently held by the Syrian Kurds. I've been talking about these people for a long time on the show, because there's not only the 1,000 ISIS fighters, but also their family members, one of which, looking to return to the UK has gotten quite a bit of attention. But looking at the fighters, what was going to happen with these guys? And I do think it's a very complicated issue. I mean, they went and they fought for ISIS. That means if you bring them back into your country, can you ever let them out in the public again? Or maybe they'll drive a truck into a crowd full of people, just because, terrorists, somebody willing to carry out an attack against a civilian population could do it so easy with, even a car. Any weapon, a steak knife is enough to kill several people in the right conditions. And so if you're worried that one of these people is still radicalized and ready to carry out an attack, then you really can't let them back into your civilian population. Another option may be to bring them back to the home countries and then put them in the criminal justice system. This could be expensive, logistically difficult. It could wreak, problems kind of with a common law system where, what are you going to do with these? Like, how much are these people guilty of? What do you actually try them with, convict them of? What kind of legal precedents and standards does it set to have them go through the criminal justice system? Because it is a fairly unique situation. If they come back to the U.S., say, are we going to start putting them in Guantanamo Bay again? If we start putting them back in Guantanamo Bay, does that mean that, prison is now open for new detainees from all over the world to start coming there if they're in any way associated with ISIS? It could also be a PR nightmare, I would imagine, giving these people any kind of platform or public attention like that. So I say all this just to point out that I don't think there's an easy solution here. The other thing is that if we leave them in Syria, I'm guessing the Syrian Kurds are just going to let most of them go. I'm not sure what Assad would do with them if the U.S. handed them over to the Syrian state, but we now at least have some idea of what's actually going to be happening with these people. In Afghanistan, I read a story that the commander of U.S. forces there, Scott Miller, is looking to reduce troop numbers by about 1,000 as part of his strategic plan for Afghanistan. This decision seems to be independent of either Trump cutting U.S. forces by 7,000 by whatever peace negotiations and what troop reductions are coming per that, or whatever's happening in the U.S. Congress. This seems to be a move solely kind of in respect to the commander of U.S. forces looking at the battlefield in Afghanistan. All right, so with that, a little bit of good news there at the end. Maybe 1,000 Americans coming home from a war we don't need to be fighting anymore. I'll go ahead and wrap up the show. Share it, libertarianinstitute.org, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Check out immersionnews.com. It's my news website. I'm doing some great things with that, and it's only going to be getting better, so bookmark that. Minds.com, the name is @Immersion News. Check out Libertarian Union on Facebook, KYAAALE on Twitter, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.